November the 22nd, 1963. President John F. Kennedy was shot to death in Dallas, and though a suspect was apprehended, more than 35 years later, the world still wonders what really happened and who was behind it. Some say agents of the U.S. government conspired to kill the president, or at least to cover up the truth. Now it is revealed that spies from the former Soviet Union conducted their own top-secret investigation. For the first time ever, the Russians speak up, including Mikhail Gorbachev, in a worldwide exclusive interview. Did the Soviets have anything to do with the killing of an American president? Do they know who did it? For the first time ever, Dealey Plaza is shut down and laser beams fired in the exclusive KGB ballistics test. Surprising revelations as we open the secret KGB JFK assassination files. More than 30 years have passed since the tragic death of U.S. President John F. Kennedy. The official explanation that the president was killed by a lone gunman has long been challenged by researchers who have noted numerous inconsistencies in the Warren Commission report. The real truth about the day that changed history is still not fully known. Much information on the JFK assassination has been kept secret, and the United States government apparently isn't the only one that has been holding such classified files. The Soviets were also interested in what happened in Dallas. And now that the Cold War is over, former spies have come forward and secret documents have surfaced, shedding new light on the plot to kill JFK. The Kennedy assassination shocked the world. Fears that a foreign power might be responsible prompted the United States to scramble its warplanes armed with atomic weapons. At the same time, the Soviets placed their military on alert, and nuclear confrontation between East and West loomed closer than anyone would have ever dared imagine. Within moments of the shooting of President Kennedy, a sequence of events began which changed the course of history. Immediately after the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, JFK was rushed to nearby Parkland Hospital. There, doctors worked in vain to save the mortally wounded president. Even before Kennedy was pronounced dead, steps were taken to transfer the powers of chief executive to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. With JFK's body on board, Air Force One headed back to Washington, and Johnson was sworn in as the new president.
I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God.
With all the confusion of the events of the day, it was not clear who was behind the shooting. It was feared that Cuba's Fidel Castro or that the Soviets might have had a hand. LBJ reportedly feared he could be next. Word reached Johnson that the exact whereabouts of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev could not be verified. This reportedly made LBJ even more suspicious of the Russians, and he placed U.S. military forces on alert. The tense standoff of the Cuban Missile Crisis had ended only months earlier, and many suspected Soviet involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Once again, tensions between the two superpowers heightened, and the USSR countered American reaction by placing its armed forces on alert as well. Fidel Castro went on television in Cuba and stated that neither he nor his country was behind the shooting of JFK. Likewise, there is evidence that Khrushchev contacted the American embassy to deny any Russian involvement in the assassination. At the same time, Khrushchev was worried that he would be implicated, or that there might indeed be some Soviet intelligence connection to the JFK shooting, so he ordered the KGB to investigate. What the Russians found was kept locked in top-secret vaults until more than 30 years later, when the breakup of the Soviet Union ended the iron grip of the KGB. Since the days of the Tsars, a strong secret police has been an integral part of Russian government. After the revolution, the new communist rulers created their own state security agency, the predecessor to the KGB. Its purpose? To stomp out any dissension and to gather intelligence both at home and abroad. At its peak during the Cold War, the KGB was the largest espionage organization in the world, with over 300,000 agents stationed throughout the USSR and every other country on the planet. Above the agency was the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. In the early 60s, the head of the KGB reported directly to Nikita Khrushchev. It was said that what was Khrushchev's opinion was the KGB's opinion. One of the foremost missions of the agency was to keep the General Secretary informed. In Dallas, the authorities were also on a mission in search of the gunman who shot President Kennedy. The prime suspect, a temporary employee who worked at the school book depository, Lee Harvey Oswald. He was arrested just 2 hours later.
There's no question that he was the killer of President Kennedy.
Although he was quickly apprehended and later determined to have been the lone assassin, there are many today who believe that Lee Harvey Oswald could not have pulled off such a bold and nearly impossible act.
In my opinion, was keen or was used as a shield, as a cover for any crime. But personally, in my opinion, it was impossible.
When the Warren Commission was formed, I believed, as I guess most Americans did, that we would learn the truth about what happened, that this would be a thorough investigation. When the report came out, it was challenged by so many people who had read it, and I read it, and I didn't believe it. I believe that Oswald was guilty, but I didn't believe any longer that he was alone.
Carl Day, a former lieutenant with the Dallas Police Department, was in charge of the crime scene.
And received a call from the police dispatcher stating there had been a shooting here and was directed to come to this location. There were several officers in the building, and when I got on the 6th floor, there was a uniformed officer there, stated that in the southeast corner of the building, which is behind me here, they had found some spent cartridges. And they ran into Oswald on the 2nd floor at the bottom of the stairs in the northwest corner. That's the way he went down from the 6th floor here, where we are now.
On the site of the former crime scene is a museum dedicated to the life, death, and legacy of John F. Kennedy. Gary Mack, archivist for the 6th floor museum, works in the same building that Oswald did at the time of the assassination.
Oswald was employed here just as a worker. His job was to pick up orders and find where the books were, because the books were stored on 2 different floors. And on the opposite part of the floor, in the northwest corner, a rifle was found. The shells matched the rifle, and the rifle was matched to Lee Harvey Oswald. That, of course, does not necessarily mean he was the one that pulled the trigger, but it does indicate he probably was.
The Soviets were way ahead of us in determining what happened. While we're busy running around worrying about Oswald and Ruby and the new president, they were already conducting a top-secret investigation into the killing in order to prove that they had nothing to do with it. They filmed their own experiments and ballistics tests. They're unbelievable. They figured out 35 years ago what took us a long time to learn.
Это доказывает, что Освальд мог бы произвести 3 выстрела за имеющееся время.
At the time we were here, we did not have a suspect. I didn't know anything about Oswald. And while we were working here, the officer got killed in the Oak Cliff section, which is about roughly 2 miles from here. And a little while later, he was arrested in Oak Cliff in connection with that shooting. So it all began to fit together. The man was waiting on the 6th floor here. As the president went by, he shot him, stashed the gun between some boxes back there, and went on down the steps to the 2nd floor.
Oswald was taken to the Dallas City Jail and was charged with the death of Officer Tippit and President Kennedy.
Oh, I think it's a man that planned this murder weeks or months ago and has laid his plans carefully and carried them out and has planned at that time what he's going to tell the police that are questioning him at present.
The authorities immediately started gathering evidence linking Oswald to the crime and made it available to the public. The world's press immediately began reporting details of Oswald's ties to the Communist Party. Some say that the Soviet leaders ordered the all-out investigation into the assassination for purposes of public relations. The idea was to avoid the implication that they had masterminded the killing of an American president. At the time, General Oleg Kalugin was a KGB spy undercover in the U.S. as the Moscow radio correspondent to the United Nations.
We were instructed immediately. We were all summoned to the residence, KGB station, and Colonel Ivanov, at that time he was a colonel. He gave us the directive from Moscow, an urgent, top priority, to go around town, pick up anyone in the street, United Nations diplomat, U.S. officials, U.S. citizens, and tell them that we all are so sorry that the president of this country was assassinated, that we have nothing to do with it, that this is some sinister forces, maybe a right-wing conspiracy, maybe mafia. But we in Russia, the USSR, we had highest respect for the President of the United States.
The KGB, once the most pervasive espionage force on the globe, now was forced to turn its attention to the acquisition of materials pertaining to the JFK case with the goal of preserving its own world image.
Plus more than 100 diplomats, plus some 50 GRU officers. We were all tasked with one mission, to impress on the American public we had nothing to do with assassination, that in fact we deplored and denounced this kind of terrorist act.
This film footage was smuggled out of Russia and is part of the KGB's top-secret investigation conducted in 1963. Never before seen in public, this amazing test film was used to brief the highest-ranking members of the Kremlin on the facts of the Kennedy case. Coming up next...
The tests on this film are astonishing for the time. This intelligence, along with what they already had on Oswald, was extremely revealing.
When the secret KGB JFK assassination files returns... even today, the question still remains. Who, or indeed, what was Lee Harvey Oswald, and why did he come to Russia? At the time, among those most interested in learning the answer to these questions was the KGB. However, neither the Soviets nor anyone else would have a chance to fully hear from the only man who could explain who or what Lee Harvey Oswald really was.
Well, I was questioned by a judge. However, I protested at that time that I was not allowed legal representation during that very short and sweet hearing.
Sunday, November 24th, 1963. Exactly 2 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, his alleged killer, Lee Harvey Oswald, is transferred under guard to the Dallas County Jail.
Oswald, how did you hurt
Suddenly, a man pushes his way through the crowd and fires a fatal shot into Oswald's abdomen. Police quickly subdue his assailant, Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Ruby is arrested and Oswald is rushed to Dallas's Parkland Hospital. Ironically, President Kennedy was taken there just 2 days before. His wounds are extensive. As doctors try to save Oswald's life, the authorities try again to get him to confess. Neither succeeds. Oswald dies on an operating table just a few hours after being shot. The world is shocked at the loss of the only man who may have explained the senseless death of President Kennedy.
But I mean, those are subtleties. We just don't know. In fact, what was going through Oswald's mind. He was murdered 2 days after the assassination, so we never got to learn anything from him, except the fact that he denied doing it.
I really don't know what the situation is about. Nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Others say Oswald was conveniently silenced before he could go to trial. Having his day in court would have given Oswald a chance to prove his innocence and give the world some possible answers to the many unanswered questions.
Of course, he never had a chance to testify. It was never a hearing. We never heard from Oswald except when he went from one hallway to another in the hands of the Dallas police saying, "I'm innocent."
Whatever secrets Oswald may have told went with him to his grave. His death, shocking as it was, still gave many Americans the closure they needed to put an even more shocking event behind them: the death of a president. Few Americans bothered to question the disturbed picture that was painted of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a monster threat, but that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
We never once considered that, hey, maybe the guy really didn't do it. We needed someone to blame, and it was him.
Oswald's murder pushed another man into the spotlight, his killer, Jack Ruby. But who was Jack Ruby?
He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Ruby's important. He killed Oswald in the Dallas police building in the basement. How did he get in there? He had a very close association with the Dallas Police Department.
Jack Ruby was a Chicago native known for his violent temper and his alleged mob connections that stretched from Chicago to Dallas. His only successful business venture, the Carousel Strip Club, was said to have been mob-controlled. But just as Ruby had associates in the mob, he also had friends in the Dallas Police Department. It has been reported that the gun that Ruby shot Oswald with was bought for him by a Dallas cop. Did his police connections make it easy for Ruby to get close to Oswald? Or was he just in the right place at the right time?
First of all, the security was terrible. The Dallas police should never have had a bar owner, who they all knew and were friendly with, inside police headquarters where the supposed assassin is being held.
There are differences in opinion regarding the motives of Jack Ruby. Some believe Ruby acted on orders from the mafia and was just a small part of a complicated plot.
It's really difficult for an American to think this and to say it, but there was a period in our history when you couldn't tell where the CIA ended and the mafia began. The CIA utilized the mafia in assassinations that the CIA planned.
Then there are those who believe that Ruby, like Oswald, was nothing more than a small-time guy looking for a way to make a big name for himself.
It's one of those serendipitous things where two paths crossed 3 days after that assassination. Lee Oswald, for his own purposes, wanting to be in the history books, and Jack Ruby, the strip club owner, wanting to be somebody, finally becomes somebody that history remembers.
More than 30 years later, the world still remembers them and still asks the question, why? Oswald was buried the day after he died. Ruby appealed for a new trial and his motion was eventually granted. However, he lost a bout with cancer and died in jail before the new trial could even begin.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder with malice as charged in the indictment and assess his punishment at death.
The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
His motive is still a mystery, but no more of a mystery than the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. The question, who was Lee Harvey Oswald, is sure to come up in any discussion on the death of JFK. There are those who believe the answer can be found in the files of the KGB.
We have an assassin involved in killing a president, a senator, or whatever. We have to piece together their life by talking to individuals who knew them as youngsters, those who worked with them, who might have known them in the army. With the KGB, we have an exceptional opportunity. I think the KGB files on Oswald are absolutely critical in many ways to getting a full understanding of him. He went into the army at the age of 16 thinking he would turn his life around, and instead he was called Mrs. Oswald, abused, teased by the fellow soldiers, and was court-martialed, twice had problems in the army, put in the stockade and thrown out. He eventually goes to Russia, thinks that's going to change his life.
In September of 1959, Oswald was granted his request for a hardship discharge from the Marines because his mother was ill. However, a month later, he arrived in Russia on a 6-day visa. No one knew that he had a longer stay in mind. Even the Russians were surprised when Oswald asked to become a Soviet citizen.
Defectors from the United States at that time were very rare birds, with very few exceptions of Russian spies who had to flee to the Soviet Union, who had no one who would come on his own and ask for political asylum. So when Lee Harvey Oswald came to Moscow, he was a curiosity of sorts, and treated generally in a favorable way, using, stick and carrot, using all sorts of bugging and listening devices. They found out that he was not a spy.
However, Vladimir Semichosny, then committee chairman for the KGB, says the Russians quickly determined that Oswald was not fit for espionage work especially with the KGB.
He was just a mediocre kind of an individual. He was just an ordinary American. We never even understood the reasons behind his asking for political asylum.
He is good for nothing. He is not good for spying. He is not a CIA. He will not do any job for the KGB because he is not that kind of a man. He will botch out everything. He will louse up everything.
With his record as a Marine, he wouldn't give us any information at all, or anything valuable. And being empty at the beginning, we reasonable enough could project that even in the future, he would remain the same. And so why should we be interested in him as a citizen?
He was ordered to leave the country immediately. However, Lee Harvey Oswald was determined to extend his stay. He slashed his left wrist in a suicide attempt and was hospitalized. Now the Soviets had a big problem. The death of an American in communist Russia would be bad PR and increase tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. In less than a week, Oswald had become a huge thorn in the side of the Russians.
And here the guy comes, he cannot do anything, he cannot deliver anything, we cannot kick him out.
Fearing that Oswald would again try suicide if forced to leave, the Soviets gave him a temporary resident status.
That was a political decision, to avoid a big scandal. When the Soviet Union could be blamed for not allowing people to immigrate to the Soviet Union.
The KGB believed that in time, Oswald would become disillusioned with Soviet life and leave on his own accord. They were right.
The Russians say, we don't want anything to do with you. They put him out in the provincial city of Minsk. He works as a factory worker. He marries a Russian girl, but he becomes so bitter about Russia that he returns to the United States after a couple of years saying this is the lesser of two evils.
Because he was a misfit, he found no home in Russia, and he started thinking of something else.
In June of 1962, Oswald, his wife Marina, and their newborn daughter left Russia. According to Posner, Oswald's actions in the 2.5 years he spent in Russia reveal his true character.
I think that the KGB portrait that they unwittingly have provided us, which is just the unedited view of Oswald living, gives us answers in some way to his character and eventually to what's going to happen in Dallas.
However, in 1962, who could have guessed that President Kennedy would be shot and Lee Harvey Oswald would be named as his assassin? From the time he arrived in the U.S. until the shooting of the president, Oswald's life can be chronicled. But his motives are still a complete mystery. Coming up next.
They took Oswald, intelligence did, sheep-dipped him with a left cover, going to Moscow, giving out fair play for Cuban community literature, and then put him up there in the book depository building in advance, knowing that the story was going to be, he's the guy that did it.
When the secret KGB JFK assassination files returns. In October of 1962, Oswald moved his family to Dallas and found work. However, his outspoken views on Marxism alienated him from his neighbors.
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophy.
He soon lost his job and his marriage was also falling apart. By all appearances, Oswald was no more successful here than he was in Russia.
When he returns here, it's one failure after another. He can't hold a job. He can't do anything right. He decides now he's going to go and become part of Castro's revolution. Goes to New Orleans, sets up the organization to free Cuba, hands out thousands of leaflets on the streets in the summer of boiling New Orleans heat, and guess what? Can't get one member to join his new organization. He's failed again.
Oswald's pro-Castro sympathies made it difficult for him to find work. In September of 1963, he traveled to Mexico in an attempt to return to Russia. General Nikolai Sergeyevich Leonov, a former KGB operative stationed in Mexico, recalls his encounter with Oswald at the Russian embassy.
And he told me that his name was Oswald Lee. For me, it was absolutely nothing. You know, I didn't imagine that this name will be famous someday. When he tried to explain me the reasons why he decided to return to the Soviet Union, he told again that he was under permanent observation in the United States. He felt to be persecuted permanently, and he was scared. He was under intensive fear, you know, that something bad will happen to him. He told me that he was living in a Mexican hotel, and the people there were searching him, were observing him. When he began to speak about the servants at the Mexican hotel, at that moment he pulled out a revolver. I begged him to hide his weapon, disarm it, to take out the bullets, but in my presence he tried to pull out the bullets. But my first impression, which was that he was a little mad, a little crazy, a little out of the normal situation. That's why I tried, like a psychologist, to calm him. He asked me to help him to get a ticket or passage for the plane to Moscow. I explained him that it was absolutely impossible, because for this it was necessary to have Russian visa. I knew that this bureaucratic process was very long, and I tried to explain him that it was necessary legally to write a sort of paper asking the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR pledging for the citizenship of the Soviet Union. Tried to do it once and couldn't, because his hands were shaking. He was very nervous. He was absolutely, I would say, he was excited.
Leonov says Oswald became hostile when told there was no way to shorten the long application process.
He began to insult me, told me that perhaps Cubans may be more comprehensive. Well, I responded to him that perhaps that he could go, if he liked, to Cuban embassy.
According to reports, Oswald went to the Cuban embassy, where he was again unable to gain entry into Russia. So he returned to Dallas. He managed to secure a temporary job at the Texas School Book Depository just a month before JFK's trip to Dallas.
Judging by the footage, it did look like the shots had come not only from the rear and out of the window somewhere in the book depository, but also from the front.
There were numerous eyewitnesses who support the Russians' observation. They say shots came from the front, from the area known as the grassy knoll.
We all four seen about the same thing as the shot. The smoke came from behind the hedge on the north side of the plaza, and a motorcycle policeman dropped his motorcycle in the street with his gun in his hand and run up to the hedge. I went north to look around the corner to see if there's anyone behind the hedge, and met Special Agent of the Katy Railroad, and I walked along with him to see if there were any tracks there, in which there were tracks and cigarettes butts where someone had been standing on the bumper.
When you do an analysis of the whole area, in terms of what people said to the FBI, what they said to the Dallas police, what they said to the Dallas Morning News, what they said to me on film, you put that together, the vast majority of everybody in Dealey Plaza said shots came from behind the wooden fence on the grassy knoll.
However, others dispute the eyewitness accounts.
Turns out that most modern ammunition is smokeless, but in addition, I went back and looked at their original testimony. None of them say there was smoke from a gun fired on the grassy knoll. They say instead they saw some smoke from the exhaust of a police motorcycle that pulled over there immediately after the assassination, which is visible on the film.
The discrepancies over the president's exit wound fuels the debate over conspiracy. Dr. Robert McClellan was part of the medical team that tried desperately to save the president's life.
That part of the skull was empty, right? There was no brain in that part of the skull, which was, I would say, the back corner of the skull that I could see.
If the exit wound was in the rear of the president's head, as every witness said it was, it means that the shot came from the front. If Lee Harvey Oswald or anybody fired from the depository from behind, and anyone else fired from the front, there's two people involved, and that means conspiracy.
However, Kennedy's autopsy photos contradict statements from McClellan and other Parkland doctors. Some believe the doctors are simply mistaken.
I always ask the question, what is the best evidence? The best evidence about where the wounds are on the president are the autopsy, x-rays, and photographs. If those are not forgeries, and they've been tested every way to Sunday to show they haven't been tampered with, then they show us precisely in photographs where the wounds are.
Others, such as forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht, believe the photos are fakes.
The published autopsy photos and the x-rays do not appear to be consistent with what we have been told by more than 24 doctors and nurses who saw the president in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital. These people all describe a big gaping defect in the back of the skull. I can't shed light on these things except to say that there is no question in my mind that additional photographs were taken.
Wecht also says the entire handling of the president's autopsy raises questions of a conspiracy.
First of all, the autopsy should have been done by the medical examiner in Dallas. That would have been in compliance with the laws of the city and county and with the state of Texas. There was no legal basis whatsoever for the body of JFK to have been removed from that jurisdiction.
Dr. Rhodes, who was on our pathology faculty and whose specialty was forensic pathology, and he was a highly expert person in this area. And according to Texas law, as he told the people who were removing the casket, they could not do that because it was against the law and that the postmortem needed to be done here. Some large person who was up at the front, I understand, literally picked Dr. Rose up under the armpits and set him to one side and told him to stand there. And they proceeded out the door.
Secondly, the autopsy then, wherever it was to be performed, should have been undertaken by the most skilled forensic pathologists in the country. The point I make is that these top people were excluded because they all shared one common flaw: they were civilians.
Wecht and others also questioned whether a single bullet could have caused the wounds to Kennedy and Governor Connolly.
Connolly had 5 wounds: the back of the chest, the front of the chest, the back of the right wrist, the front of the right wrist, and then the left thigh. So these wounds, which are all matched up, by the way, under the cockamamie single bullet theory with the 2 wounds in John Kennedy, back and front of the neck, these wounds are not in alignment when you look at the Zapruder film.
Then it all comes back to the question of Oswald himself. Did he assassinate President Kennedy? Again, there are differences of opinion.
Well, in my opinion, the first impression that it was a very well-planned assassination in which participated more than one people.
In my view, politics plays part of it. Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't really as much a communist as an anarchist, but he's striking out and putting himself in the history books, and he does that successfully 35 years ago.
We were given a profile of Oswald as this loner, this crazy loner, violent, hated President Kennedy, and nobody challenged it, not till years later. When individual researchers started talking to people who knew Oswald, they said, well, no, he admired President Kennedy. He had always said he admired President Kennedy.
Wherever you see Oswald, you see intelligence footprints. That is not to say, in my view, that Oswald was part of the intelligence scheme to kill Kennedy. They took Oswald, intelligence did, sheep-dipped him with a left cover from Moscow, given out fair play for Cuba community literature, and then put him up there in the book depository building in advance, knowing that the story was going to be, he's the guy who did it.
However, after numerous investigations, the government maintains its official position. A lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, is responsible for the death of President Kennedy. Determining Oswald's guilt or innocence are finally revealed when the secret KGB JFK assassination files returns. When high-profile crimes occur in Russia, top forensic scientists work on solving the cases at the National Crime Lab in Moscow. And this is where work was done on reconstructing the assassination of President Kennedy. Two of the top Russian authorities on crime scene ballistics have examined various films, documents, and photographic evidence relating to the JFK assassination. Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Martinikov and Colonel Felix Vyskobov are the chief and director of the Department of Ballistics for the Russian Federal Police.
We have done a study with the help of special equipment. It can be clearly seen that an oval-shaped explosion goes forward. This couldn't happen if the shot came from the front. If there is a small firearm injury at the back of the head, then it could not be an exit wound. The injury at the exit is always bigger than the one at the entrance, due to the law of physics. Had there been several injuries, it would have been a different situation. But there is just one wound, and it's cone-shaped, so there is no question that the shooting was done from the back. In my opinion, the president and the governor were shot with 2 bullets. There could have been one shooter or 2 shooters. On the windshield of the car there are 2 fractures caused by firearm shots from the rear. If they came from the front, they would have gone straight through the glass.
The initial movement of the head forward is very minuscule, while the second reaction is more vivid. It's an after effect. It's not the initial or the most important evidence here. Due to the movement of the car, at the point of impact, the body is relaxed momentarily, and then, of course, due to inertia, the body is pushed back, and that is the visual effect that we see here, but has nothing to do with the bullet itself.
We also would like to note that on the basis of our analysis, we cannot confirm that it was Oswald who did the shooting. It could have been anyone. I believe that one person could have fired this amount of shots without difficulty, especially if you take into account the statement of Oswald's wife that on several occasions she caught him aiming the rifle through the window, recharging the rifle as fast as he could. First of all, according to the data in the possession of KGB, Oswald trained for a long time with the weapon. So after a long period, he could finally fire several precise shots within a short period of time. Also, we shouldn't forget that the first shot was aimed at the head. However, the first bullet hit the neck area, It was a miss anyway. According to the data, the shot in the head came in as a third, or maybe even as a fourth shot. There is no unanimous opinion as to how many shots were fired. We cannot totally exclude the possibility that the bullets that hit the president and the governor were not found, and the bullets that were found had been planted. Neither can we confirm that the shots were made from this rifle and with the bullets which were found in the car, since the bullets were not extracted from the body. We cannot exclude the possibility that a group of shooters might have also been positioned in front. But seeing that the president was hit in the head, and this is the fatal wound, of course, they might not have been engaged because they had seen that the president had already been hit. Of course, there is another possibility that they took the shot and missed.
Newly uncovered evidence proves the KGB conducted its own testing during the early 1960s to verify the likelihood of a single gunman theory. This startling footage, smuggled out of Russia, was shot during those tests. The narrator states that the test's purpose was to determine whether or not 3 precise shots could have been fired within 6 seconds.
The targets were located at approximately the same distance as the president's car during the 3 shots. One shot at a distance of 50 meters, the second at 100 meters, and the third at 110 meters. Having done some training with the rifle, the shooter managed to hit 2 or 3 targets consecutively in less than 6 seconds. This demonstrates that Oswald could have made 3 shots during the given time.
Compelled by the Soviets' results, we decided to test the rifle's abilities ourselves. The weapon recovered at the Kennedy crime scene was a Mannlicher Kakano that showed considerable wear. The Kakano uses a high-powered cartridge, a full metal jacketed bullet that travels in excess of 2,000 feet per second, a very effective sniper's ammunition. But the rifle itself would not generally be the sniper's weapon of choice. Its biggest drawback is its bolt action, which must be cycled after each shot. As the bolt is pulled back, the firing mechanism is cocked, requiring a considerable amount of force. At the same time, the spent shell is ejected. All of this forceful pushing and pulling not only wastes precious seconds, but also disrupts the shooter's rhythm, as the gun must be repositioned and re-aimed after every shot. The FBI conducted a similar test in which 3 master riflemen attempted to reenact the shooting within 6 seconds. Like the Soviets, the FBI fired at 3 stationary targets at varying distances up to 265 feet. Only one of the experts was able to complete the 3 shots in less than 6 seconds, and none were able to hit the head or neck of the target. Oswald was considered an experienced shooter, but not an expert. Outdoor television show host John Ross considers himself an average shooter and volunteered to test the Kakano. He was given time to practice with the gun. Then 3 targets were placed at distances approximating the Kennedy car. He attempted the series of 3 shots, 6 separate times. The results were surprising. In each series, he was able to fire the 3 shots in less than 6 seconds. At the 2 closest targets, each headshot was accurate, and on the furthest target, he was able to hit the head or neck area 3 out of 6 times. Although our tests did not completely replicate the circumstances that occurred on November the 22nd, 1963, we believe, as did the KGB, that it does approximate them closely enough to confirm the possibility of a single gunman having carried out the shooting as described by the Warren Commission. The testing also yielded another interesting discovery. To fire multiple shots from the Carcano, the ammunition must be loaded into a clip, which is then inserted into the rifle. In his book, In Search of Lee Harvey Oswald, Robert Groden refers to a clip mentioned in the Warren report as mysterious because it was not in the original evidence inventory. We noted that after all the rounds were fired, the empty clip remained in the rifle and was only ejected after the shooter pushed a button on the inside of the trigger guard. The empty clip could have remained in the rifle, having not been recorded into evidence until the gun was later examined. All of this served to substantiate what the Soviets apparently learned some 30 years ago. With the results from their tests, the KGB and top Soviet officials privy to such top-secret information would have drawn certain conclusions and arrived at theories about what really happened. Former head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, finally reveals what he knows about the JFK assassination in a worldwide exclusive interview, when the secret KGB JFK assassination files returns. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ensuing chaos left previously well-guarded materials less secure. Though most leads proved to be ultimately unproductive, we found that with perseverance, money, and a bit of luck, it is possible to acquire classified Soviet documents. Using a hidden camera, we recorded numerous meetings over a period of months in which we attempted to obtain relevant materials. This transaction between one of our Moscow contacts and black market dealers proved to be one of the more successful ventures, though, as you'll see, not without a few tense moments.
It was harder than we expected, so we need more money. The deal was $5,000. Yeah, I understand. I perfectly understand that, but we got too much more. Look at this stuff. Real authentic stuff. Good stuff. But we are going to scan. I see. It looks good. That's what I'm talking about. We need more money. But our deal was $5,000. So what? We got you much more. Look, it's twice more than you expected. Right? This is about what I expected. This is what I'm talking about. And we need to pay our man. We need to just, take care of stuff. Our deal is $5,000. That's all I have. Okay, so we need more money. 10%. I'm talking, we need more money, okay? Like, we can get, okay, let's do that. Like, give us 5,000, that's okay, and the rest you can give, like, tomorrow, the next day, like, whatever. 5,000 is the deal, that's it, I can't do that. This is all I have. Okay, so come on, let's talk. Hey, run up!
Finally, safe from the black market dealers, we discovered that some of the recovered documents corroborate what we had been told by the ex-KGB agents. The entire world was shocked by the impact of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. In the Soviet Union, however, the shock soon turned to grave concern. General Leonov, the KGB operative who met Lee Harvey Oswald at the Soviet embassy, remembers doubting that Oswald could have fired the fatal shot. He still questions both Oswald's emotional stability and his skill as a marksman.
His emotional situation, his emotional status, how I saw him in Mexico, was absolutely unacceptable. He could be anything. He could be a star in shooting some years before. But at that moment, I mean in September, he was absolutely unfit for this sort of sports. Absolutely unfit.
General Leonov doesn't think Oswald did it. Ilya Semyonovich Pavlotsky was the highest-ranking agent in the KGB unit that formed the agency's official conclusion. In this startling statement, he agrees with General Leonov.
My group, the Special Section for Analysis, concluded that President Kennedy was not killed by Oswald. There was a lot of difference of opinion in the KGB, but one thing we all agreed that was Oswald was too incompetent to pull this off.
In the world of espionage and secret intelligence, both sides often knew what the other was up to. So in launching its own investigation into the assassination, the KGB had access to key sources and privileged information.
Some European capitals were gathered, high-ranked officials of the CIA and the Soviet intelligence, when all the questions were aroused and resolved. And the American part and the Soviet part reaffirmed their absolute negation and no acceptation of any brutal act against officers of intelligence.
General Leonov claims that the Cold War was, in fact, a coordinated effort with carefully drawn guidelines of engagement, leaving little room for political assassination.
We always were absolutely accurate about the observation of the rules of the professional work.
Vladimir Semochasny, who commanded the KGB during the Kennedy years, was the man most responsible for the security of the Soviet state.
My feeling is that there were the big money of taxes, the magnates, but who was used by them in the concrete situation, whether that was FBI or CIA, that I'm not in a position to discuss. But it was definitely the result of Kennedy's efforts to find better relations with the Soviet Union and the result of his policies of making life a little harder for the rich in that country. You can call that an American coup d'etat, but I would think this was simply an effort to those forces to substitute Kennedy with a more forthcoming president, and Lyndon Johnson was exactly that kind of person.
But not all ex-KGB officers agree with their former commander. General Leonov proposes that a more compelling motive can be found in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs. By 1963, anti-Castro forces in the United States were disillusioned with President Kennedy. The failure of the rebel-led invasion of Cuba and Kennedy's refusal to commit American forces was seen by many Cubans in America as a grave betrayal.
It was always an opinion, personal opinion, that it was the result of activities, clandestine, of course, activities of the Cuban refugees in United States, in Florida, who were absolutely irritated with the failure of all the invasions during 61, 62 against Cuba, and the refusal of President Kennedy to support massive aggression against Cuba.
Mikhail Gorbachev was General Secretary of the Soviet Union during his final years. It was his policy of glasnost, or openness, that shook the foundations of the KGB and led to its downfall.
The Warren Commission, I think, either was unable to learn the truth and to complete the investigation, or they decided to conceal some of the truth based on what they saw as the vital interest of the nation. Whatever has been written more recently about John F. Kennedy, about his personal life and some personal weaknesses, I hold that he was a great president. He had great plans for the future of the United States and the world, that had great promise for the entire world. The world could have turned out quite differently if those plans were realized. And my question is, was this really to the liking of some people both in your country and perhaps in our country and elsewhere? That's my question.
While Kennedy struggled with his political adversaries, he was loved and idealized not only by the American public, but by many around the world. Yet at the same time, this charismatic young leader managed to accumulate more enemies than almost any other president before him. Facts of the assassination and of Lee Harvey Oswald's life have been interpreted to suggest connections with the mafia, anti-Castro forces, pro-Castro forces, the CIA, the FBI, the KGB, and South Vietnam. Often using the same information, conspiracy theorists and now former officials of the KGB present what they feel is compelling proof of their belief in the causes and motives behind the events in Dealey Plaza.
I think that the evidence shows clearly that the Central Intelligence Agency was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. The question comes up whether other groups involved, was the mafia involved?
The KGB agreed. Their official position was based on the findings of the analytical section. This astounding conclusion is explained by group leader Colonel Pavlotsky.
Kennedy was shot by a professional assassin hired by French and Vietnamese agents. We knew that the Americans helped overthrow and murder South Vietnam President Ngo Diem, who they had kept in power to fight the communists. Diem's brother Ngo Dinh Nhu was also killed, and this cut off the supply of opium that Nhu had been helping the Corsican mafia smuggle to Marseille. The Corsicans made the opium into heroin and then shipped it to the United States, where American gangsters sold the drugs. Our group found that the Corsicans hired French hitman Michel Mertz, sometimes known as Jean-René Soutre, to carry out the assassination with the cooperation of the American mafia bosses.
For the first time ever, Dealey Plaza is shut down and laser beams fired in the exclusive KGB ballistics test, proving once and for all where the deadly shots originated. When the secret KGB JFK assassination files returns. In the course of our Russian investigation, we discovered an intriguing opinion published by a leading ballistics expert for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. N.V. Martinikov suggested the modern technique of using precision test lasers to study the ballistics of the JFK assassination.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade group.
Dealey Plaza, November the 22nd, 1963.
The Dallas newsman, Mel Couch, happened to look up at about the 5th or 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. He said he saw the rifle being pulled back in.
It's official. As of just a few moments ago, the President of the United States is dead.
Car's moving. Okay. Gentlemen, we need all of you right here, right now.
Now, some 35 years later, the plaza is closed down by the city of Dallas for this one-of-a-kind experiment.
Everything is okay. We're ready to go. Shoot your laser. We're going to recreate the shooting scenario, as many various scenarios as possible, and using laser technology to establish the lines of trajectory. I would like to determine one more favorable or one that seems to fit better.
Anthony Larry Paul has over 30 years of experience in crime scene reconstruction, serving as ballistics instructor for the FBI as well as the Philadelphia and Los Angeles police departments.
In order to achieve this test, we had to compile a team of recognized experts. The team was comprised of our laser expert, Mr. Heinz Tamal, Dr. Vincent DiMaio, who has an impeccable reputation as a forensic pathologist, Mr. Robert Groden, who is a photographic expert and has done a great deal of research in the John F. Kennedy assassination. And Mr. Ronald Singer, who is a criminalist and certainly has a great deal of expertise in crime scene reconstruction and in the area of criminalistics. Yeah, I see the beam. I see the beam in the shadow. I see it in the shadows.
Heinz Tummel, a pioneer of laser engineering, was the first scientist to conceive of laser sighting for the weapons industry some 30 years ago. He explains his role in the Dealey Plaza reconstruction.
I have constructed and developed special lasers for this task. Some lasers were done in such a manner that we can determine the trajectory of the bullet to locate the point where the bullet would originate and terminate, for that matter. And the reason why is because the laser generates a very straight line and a very powerful line, so it can be measured over long distances.
Yes.
Hey, Larry, car's moving. Let's get that thing back up because they're going to work on this.
You're going to stay on the same side you are. Good, good, very good. Perfect, perfect. You're right over the edge. Good. We used our surveyors to then spot the vehicles in 3 different positions. One being a position that was prior to the first strike. The second position being that position that was where the president was shot the first time. And the third position being that location where the president was shot the second time. When we used our surveyors to place the vehicle in the correct location, we did that independent of the published figures by the Warren Commission and by the FBI report. Right. But let's look at the location of the vehicle, and then let's look at this. Let's put a shooter up here. Yeah. And now let's run that line of trajectory.
Yeah, with the laser we can do.
And that's what we're going to do.
Initially, we started out trying to use the information from the government, and a lot of people think just because we have a lot of numbers that's sufficient, but it's very hard to retrace that. And so the only thing we had that was reliable were the photographs from the Zapruder film. So we set up in the same position that Mr. Zapruder was in, set up our transit in that location, and using existing landmarks in those frames, we're able to line up our transit and therefore relocate the car.
Okay, you have to come up. There's like a black spot right in the center. Yeah, right there. Go back the other way, a little bit to the other way now. Go left. Whoa, go right there. Straight. Good.
How's that look for the body position now?
Finally, the team was satisfied that the car was in the exact position that it was in when the first shot hit President Kennedy.
And our areas are lined with the government's areas to the inch. And you can't get more accurate than that. Nor can you become more confident in what was done originally by the government employees some 35 years ago.
The car used in the study is identical to the presidential limousine that JFK was riding in the day he was shot. The precise dimensions of the limousine, as well as the characteristics of its suspension and drive shaft, were of the utmost concern to the team. It was imperative that the car behave exactly as it would have in November of 1963. Next, articulating mannequins, the type that are used in courtroom testimony, were set into place to represent the President and Governor Connolly.
Now, right where you are right now, Salvador can look right down at the limb that we want to try to pull over to the north side.
Due to the passage of time, the Texas live oak tree that sits in front of the school book depository has grown to the point of obscuring the line of sight between the window and the points on Elm Street where the presidential limousine would have been. Therefore, the ballistics team members found it necessary to call in the City of Dallas Parks Department to help solve the dilemma.
There's two limbs that go like this, and the bulk of those limbs covers the window. I mean, that's where the coverage is. So they're going to try to separate them like this first. If that doesn't work, then they're going to take this limb off.
Ronald Singer is the chief criminalist for the Tarrant County Criminalistic Laboratory, a premier independent crime lab based in Fort Worth, Texas.
If we could get some more critical views from the Zapruder films, I'd like to test some of the other theories, other locations, and see exactly what we can eliminate. And I think that's really the way you need to go with any kind of study like this, is that you eliminate the fringe theories. And the more theories you eliminate, the closer you come to the actual truth. It's like Sherlock Holmes said. Once you've eliminated all of the impossible, all that's left is the truth.
The bullet will usually flip and travel backwards, you know, with the base falling after a certain point.
That's pretty much arbitrary. But I'm not
no, that is wound ballistics. This is wound ballistics.
Due to the importance of the information that this testing could add to the ongoing study of the JFK assassination, there were times when tempers flared amongst the team's members. Reaching unanimous agreement at times seemed impossible.
Any photograph showing the bullet impacting him. And he would not even realize...
Assume a forward motion and a rearward motion behind the fence because of picture.
No. What we're saying is that when you take into account the trajectory, you take into account the wounds, this is, in all medical probability, in all reasonable scientific probability, the way the bullet traveled and what it did. Now, you can say, well, is this possible? Is that possible? He could have been shot by somebody hanging from underneath a flying saucer with a ray gun. Yeah, that's possible.
As the chief medical examiner for San Antonio, Texas, Dr. Vincent DeMaio's reputation in the forensic pathology field is unsurpassed. He has authored textbooks and medical papers that have set the standard for his field.
I think what I want to do is just present what the objective evidence is in this case, to eliminate some of the mythology about the nature of the wounds and the weapons, and then let people make up their own mind. I'm interested essentially in the scientific aspect of the case.
Yeah. Oh, look at it light up. Sure, okay.
The testing at the first point on Elm Street proved to be enigmatic. The balance of the team concluded that the shot most likely came from the sixth-floor window of the school book depository, as both the Warren Commission and KGB had concluded.
We finally got it, and of course there's a little give and take as to where the entrance is. But of course, again, because the wound wasn't located exactly as to right or left of the midline at the time of the autopsy, it's just a rough approximation.
Robert Groden, however, believed the shot could have been fired from another position, suggesting that there might have been a second shooter.
I see it in the
Coming
shadow.
up next.
Yeah. Oh, look at it light up.
Perfectly on axis.
Give me 6 more inches.
It's just about right on.
There it is.
Christ, that's the second floor of the Deltex building.
When the secret KGB JFK assassination files returns.
We're running out of time. I don't want to run out of time. We're running out of time. Yeah, I see the beam. I see the beam in the shadow. I see it in the shadow. Yeah. Oh, look at it light up.
Perfectly on axis.
Give me 6 more inches.
It's just about right on.
There it is.
Christ, that's the second floor of the Deltex building.
The testing at the first point on Elm Street proved to be enigmatic. balance of the team concluded the shot most likely came from the 6th floor window of the school book depository, as both the Warren Commission and KGB had concluded.
We finally got it, and of course there's a little give and take as to where the entrance is. But of course, again, because the wound wasn't located exactly as to right or left of the midline at the time of the autopsy, it's just a rough approximation.
Robert Groden, however, believed that the shot could have been fired from another position, suggesting that there might have been a second shooter.
One of the most significant things that we were able to do with this testing is to find that there is additional confirmation for a suspected firing point that has been suspect now for well over 30 years, and that is the 2nd floor of the Dow Tex building.
If we look at the line of trajectory where the president has been shot, 3 degrees of rotation puts that shot in perfect alignment with the 6th floor school book depository room. 3 degrees out puts that projectile in the 2nd floor area of Daltex building. Unfortunately, there is no hard evidence or tangible proof that there was ever a shooter located in that 2nd floor area. So if we go back to the physical evidence, everything points to the 6th floor as being the location of the shooter. Just drift a little bit. That's it. Come on over. Drift a little over.
Once testing was completed at the first position, the automobile was then moved into place to test the fatal head wound to President Kennedy.
The team had come to the opinion that the shot originated from the back of the president. And that was based on the blood splatter, on the eruption of the spray of blood, and on the examination of the remaining portions of the skull.
This is consistent with an exit because you've got a high-velocity missile. The only type bullet that will produce so extensive a network of fractures in the skull is a bullet traveling at a very high velocity, okay? A rifle bullet, essentially. So when it comes in, it makes usually a relatively neat hole, and when it comes out, it produces a very large exit, especially if the wound is very superficial. Actually, if the wound is deeper, like from here to here, the exit wound is smaller, because the force generated by the bullet going through the brain can be absorbed by the whole head. Here, it's kind of like just ripping off the top of the head. So when you see at the exit, you'll see blood and tissue ejected in a cloud, a very a mist-like cloud, pink in color, and this is vaporized blood. And the little droplets are all less than a millimeter, just tiny. And so you have a kind of cloud of blood. And this is what the motorcycle riders later wrote into. They wrote into the cloud of blood.
Robert Groden, once again, was not convinced that the shot was a back-to-front wound.
No, see, everything that we've come up with on our side of the argument for all these years, everything is being totally ignored here.
No, because what you're saying is that he's buckling at the instant that he's shot. That's not what happens in most people. Most people are shot and some passage of time, and then they react.
But we're not talking about knowledge or reaction. We're talking about transfer of momentum. We're talking about the bullet striking him and making him buckle.
No, that's make-believe.
That's right.
That's Arnold Schwarzenegger pictures. If I took a body, hung it from a line straight, took a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with 12-gauge slug, double-O buck, and shot that body in the chest, it's not going to move at all.
Once it was determined that it was a back-to-front shot, the trajectories were then plotted. And the trajectories went back to that 6th floor window, the school book depository.
Having tested the positions as outlined in the Warren Commission report, the team then moved on to testing alternate theories.
The idea, the hypothesis of more than one headshot has been around and accepted by leading experts in the field of the assassination for decades. That is, that more than one bullet would have been used to cause this much damage in the president's head. And with all the witnesses in the plaza that were aware of shots coming from the front, it makes sense.
Right now, we have Mr. Groden, who is setting up his line of trajectory with an opinion that possibly the shooter or one of the shooters could have been located or could have been positioned on the grassy knoll. For the most part, the grassy knoll was eliminated because it was in the incorrect position to establish any accurate lines of trajectory to either of the victims of the shooting. And secondly, there's a very large sign that would have prohibited a shooter from being located in a large portion of that grassy knoll.
I don't see it. It doesn't appear to me that that's...
Do we have other areas that we want to take a look at? Other possible locations of shooters?
There's one other.
There are others. You know what? We're going to set up...
The other one would be the one that has been hypothesized down at the corner where the stockade fence meets the cement.
From that location, you would have an ideal place for a shooter to be located. However, that would have meant that the windshield would have been shot out of the vehicle, and the trajectory was incorrect once again. And another theory that was tested was the shot originating from the location of the storm drain. That location was quickly dismissed as the shot would have had to have been very, very quick. There would have been no opportunity to aim the firearm. The window of time was minimal. As a result, although the trajectory was okay, nothing else lined up for the team, and that theory was quickly dismissed.
Finally, the testing was complete. Even though the team members were in agreement that they could have remained in Dealey Plaza for weeks, they had made some significant headway in the analysis of the case.
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is that I'm very pleased with what we did. I actually got more out of it than I expected that we would when I first got involved in it. I think the best thing that we did was that based on the laser trajectories that we shot from the grassy knoll area, as well as from the area of the overpass, I think we plainly showed with good, sound scientific evidence that there couldn't have been a shot there that hit President Kennedy in the head.
Based upon the testing we've done over the last couple of days, and the autopsy and the photographs and x-rays, which I had a chance to look at, I would have to say our test is in agreement with the findings of the government.
I find it fascinating that both of the laser tests that we did led back primarily and initially to the second floor of the Dow Tex building. Both of the shots came from there, and that spot has always been a suspected firing point going all the way back to 1964.
Our mission was to establish the facts based on physical evidence. And when we based everything on the physical evidence, our location came back primarily to the 6th floor schoolbook depository. This does not preclude the possibility of other shooters. There could have been numerous shooters in that area. The location was an ideal location for an ambush. However, there's just no evidence anywhere but that schoolbook depository to base an opinion on. It's impossible for us as a team to base an opinion on conjecture. We must base an opinion on the physical evidence. And I am not suggesting that this was one person acting alone to assassinate the President of the United States. I am just suggesting that the evidence says that it was sources came from one location.
Results of our tests and the KGB's startling conclusions. When the secret KGB JFK assassination files returns. With the findings of our American experts recorded, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Martinikov and Colonel Felix Viskobov of the Russian Crime Lab viewed the videotape of the Dealey Plaza reconstruction. Their opinions seem to reconfirm those of the American ballistics team.
I would like to attract your attention to the fact that on the basis of this study, what can be said for sure is that the shot struck from the rear. According to this information, there are other versions as to who shot President from the rear. But our contacts with the American experts testify to the fact that other versions are not excluded. However, it doesn't dismiss the conclusions about the shots coming from the rear. Also, there is no data here which would contradict the fact that the shots were fired from the Melica Carcano 6.5 rifle. But the shots could have been fired from this rifle or any other rifle of the same caliber. But it would be impossible to solve this problem now, even with the help of the experts. If this data is correct, then we definitely stick to our opinion.
While Lieutenant Colonel Martinikov and Colonel Viskobov feel that the laser ballistics test was conclusive from a scientific standpoint, they believe that much more study is necessary. They also feel, however, that the KGB's original conclusions still stand, despite the factor of human error at the time of the original investigation.
I believe this question will never be answered because at the moment of the assassination there was a lot of confusion and it's practically impossible to determine where they found the bullets which were later presented in the case.
After 35 years, many questions surrounding the killing of President Kennedy remain unanswered. But now we know several important facts based on our own testing and the findings in the KGB's files. We know the KGB conducted a top-secret investigation into the assassination even before agencies of the U.S. government reached their own conclusions. We know the Soviets ruled out Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman, as the Warren Commission claimed. The KGB considered Oswald unfit to pull off the shooting by himself and believed it to be a conspiracy. For the first time, we have proven that the shots which hit President Kennedy and Governor Connolly could only have come from one direction, from behind the presidential limousine. There were no shots fired from the so-called grassy knoll or anywhere else in front of the car. And we have shown that the Daltex building was indeed a possible point of origin for a second shooter. We have also found that the KGB officially concluded that supporters of murdered Vietnam President Ngo Dinh Diem conspired with members of the Corsican and American mafia to kill JFK. Uncovered documents and evidence in the possession of both the U.S. and former Soviet Union have only begun to settle the enduring controversy. Hopefully, further study and more unearthed evidence will shed more light on this case. Despite the emergence of another theory with each newly uncovered piece of evidence, the violent murder of America's youngest president remains unsolved. Was Lee Harvey Oswald indeed a mentally unstable sniper acting alone, or was he, as he claimed, just a patsy for a far bigger plot? Perhaps the final chapter can be found in the still hidden and secret files held by the American government or its former adversaries. Thanks for joining us.
November 22nd, 1963. The world is stunned by a shocking crime.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
The government concluded that President John F. Kennedy was killed by a single assassin acting alone. But most Americans have never believed it. Tonight, a look at the forensic evidence to search for answers to a 40-year-old mystery. Could one bullet go through both the president and the governor of Texas? Was there another assassin firing at the president from the so-called grassy knoll? And we'll conduct a new, state-of-the-art forensic analysis of this crude recording of a police radio transmission. Does it hold the secrets of a conspiracy to kill the President of the United States? Texas, November 22nd, 1963. For President John F. Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline, the day began as many political visits do, with crowds of well-wishers and dignitaries meeting them at the airport. The president was running late, but he took a few moments to shake hands. At 10 minutes before noon, the presidential motorcade began its 11-mile journey through downtown Dallas. Joining the Kennedys in the limousine were Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. There were a few protesters, but most bystanders gave the president an enthusiastic welcome. Gail Newman and her husband Bill were waiting in Dealey Plaza with their two young boys as the motorcade approached.
I had never seen a president in person, and I was quite anxious to see both he and Mrs. Kennedy because they were so popular.
Farther down the street, a Dallas businessman, Abraham Zapruder, was shooting what was to become the most famous home movie in history.
I remember seeing the president's car coming towards us, and the first two shots rang out, and it was a bang, bang, felt like that.
Gunfire hit the president in the back. Governor Connally was also wounded, and then a fatal wound to the president's head.
The limousine is now traveling at a very high rate of speed. Secret Service men standing up in the limousine. They are armed with submachine guns. It appears as though someone in the limousine might have been hit by the gunfire.
Doctors were able to save Governor Connally, but there was little they could do for the mortally wounded president.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
As news of the assassination spread, the Dallas police frantically searched for suspects. A witness saw a rifle in the sixth-floor window of a warehouse, the Texas School Book Depository, behind the presidential motorcade. A few hours later, an employee of the depository, Lee Harvey Oswald, was arrested for allegedly killing a Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippett, who had stopped Oswald for questioning. Oswald was later charged with killing the president. He claimed he was innocent, but his background was troubling. He was a former Marine who had defected to Russia and embraced communism, but later returned to the United States.
He had handed out pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans. He looked like an instrument of the Soviet Union.
But Oswald never got the chance to tell his story. 2 days after the assassination, on live television, a man stepped from the shadows and shot Lee Harvey Oswald as he was being escorted through police headquarters. Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, owned a Dallas strip club.
Jack Ruby had a halo around him, and the halo said organized crime. He was raised in Chicago, associated with organized crime figures there, including Capone. He came to Dallas and was part of the underworld of Dallas.
Oswald's murder fueled speculation that there had to be a larger conspiracy to kill the president and that Ruby had killed Oswald to silence him. Ruby died a few years later in prison. He always denied there was a conspiracy, but that hasn't stopped the speculation.
It was too awful to imagine that a president could be removed from office without something more weighty than Lee Harvey Oswald sitting in the Texas Book Depository. I mean, on the face of it, that's just unacceptable, isn't it?
Nevertheless, the forensic evidence against Oswald seemed overwhelming. A Mannlicher Carcano rifle found on the 6th floor of the school book depository had Oswald's palm print visible when it was disassembled. A backyard photograph showed Oswald holding the rifle. Forensic analysis identified Oswald's handwriting on the postal money order to Klein's Sporting Goods, the store that sold the weapon. Cotton fibers from the shirt Oswald was wearing when arrested were the same as those found in between the rifle stock and the metal butt plate of the rifle. On the morning of the assassination, Oswald walked into the school book depository carrying a paper pouch he said it contained curtain rods. Paper fibers from that pouch linked the gun to a blanket in Oswald's garage. Oswald's prints were on the cardboard boxes that surrounded the so-called sniper's nest in the school book depository. The forensic evidence made a strong case linking Oswald to the alleged murder weapon. The president's autopsy should have provided more answers, but the way it was handled has raised controversy and suspicion.
The persons involved in doing the autopsy had no training to do a medical legal autopsy, and the doctors here had no training in gunshot wounds.
Two Navy pathologists, Dr. James Humes and Dr. J. Thornton Boswell, performed the autopsy, and by all accounts, made numerous mistakes. They didn't examine the president's clothing to locate the bullet holes. The path of the bullet wound in Kennedy's back wasn't fully examined.
By the way, do you know, they never even knew on the night of the autopsy that there was a bullet hole in the front of the president's neck. As far as they were concerned, they were seeing a tracheostomy.
And the most critical of all, they didn't describe the head wound properly.
Dr. Humes didn't know how to describe bullet injuries, so at one point he says the fractures of the skull caused by the second bullet are too complex to permit verbal description, and I will rely upon the photographs and x-rays. The photographs didn't come out.
I don't think that they were part of some massive conspiracy. They were inept, forensically incompetent, totally inexperienced. They botched the job completely. They missed it.
The results of the autopsy were disclosed by a blue ribbon panel appointed by President Johnson and chaired by the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren. Its investigation concluded it was an open and shut case.
The commission reports that the fatal shots that entered President Kennedy's head and throat were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald from the Texas School Book Depository, acting solely by himself, and that there was no conspiracy, either foreign or domestic.
Almost immediately, the Warren report was ridiculed because of inaccuracies, both real and perceived.
The sketch that was published as part of the Warren Commission of the position of President Kennedy's head and the placement of where the bullet entered are not correct.
But the president was dead and the governor wounded. Were all these injuries caused by a single shooter? When we return, the forensics of what has been called the magic bullet theory and the search for answers. As Americans mourned the loss of their charismatic young president, many found it hard to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. A government commission concluded Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, which was behind the presidential motorcade, as it passed by. 1 shot missed. Another struck both President Kennedy and Governor Connally. And the 3rd caused the fatal wound. For 40 years, there's been an ongoing debate as to whether 1 bullet could have passed through both the president and the governor.
Now, the single bullet theory is total nonsense.
Dr. Cyril Wecht is a forensic pathologist who has never accepted the single bullet theory.
It's an incredible bit of convenient fiction designed to put the case to rest, to allay the anxiety of this country, indeed of the world, and to have done with it.
Dr. Wecht doesn't believe that the president and governor were in the right position for 1 bullet to go through both men. This demonstration shows why.
1 bullet entered John Kennedy in the back, coursed through his neck, goes out, it stops in midair, it comes back about 18 to 20 inches, hits John Connally behind the right armpit, pierces the right lung, breaks the right 5th rib, exits from a point below the nipple, swings up and around, hits John Connally in the back of the right wrist, shatters the distal end of the radius, exits from the front of his right wrist, and goes into his left thigh, strikes the femur, and then falls somehow onto a stretcher, only to be fortuitously found by the maintenance man at Parkland Hospital. Lo and behold, there was this bullet.
Because the bullet seemed to defy the laws of physics, Dr. Wecht has dubbed it the magic bullet.
It happily, readily, and magically accommodates you and fits in with any scenario that you choose to apply to it at a given moment in time.
Could advances in forensic science shed any new light on this controversy? In 1991, forensic experts at Failure Analysis Associates, an engineering firm, tested the single bullet hypothesis using crime scene reconstruction techniques not available in 1963. First, engineers took precise measurements of Dealey Plaza using a digital surveying system.
It shoots out a ranging piece of electromagnetic information and can tell you the distance from your transit to that point with about 1/100th of an inch accuracy.
Next, they took measurements of the president's limousine, built a plywood replica, placed 2 men inside, approximately the same height and weight as the president and governor, and digitally captured the images. As a reference, they used the positions of both men as shown in the Zapruder film. In digitizing the Zapruder film, frame by frame, the engineers at Failure Analysis made an important discovery.
We noticed in just 1 frame, Connally's lapel flips up and back. 60,000ths of a second it's gone. And of course, 1 frame is too fast for the eye to catch by about a factor of 2. So no one had seen it before. But what that very fortuitous discovery gave us was exact timing of the bullet passing through his chest and his lapel.
As Governor Connally's lapel moves, he's turning to look at the president.
Because he had heard the first bullet discharge that had missed, and he turned around, and then the second one caught him not as he was sitting bolt upright looking ahead, but as he was moving around to see the president.
As the president emerges from behind the highway sign, it is clearly visible that he's been hit, just an 1/18th of a second later. The animation shows that President Kennedy was sitting higher than Governor Connally, who was on a jump seat below and slightly to the left of the president. This red line represents the path a bullet would take from the 6th floor of the school book depository. If the president was leaning slightly forward at the time of the shooting, and Governor Connally is positioned as he was at the moment his lapel moved, the bullet trajectory into the president's back, through his throat, and into Governor Connally's back is a straight line.
If the governor is turning to look at the president, the bullet goes through his back out his right chest.
It would have changed direction only slightly after breaking Governor Connolly's rib in order to go through his right wrist and into his thigh.
A connect the dot exercise, but the dots, in this case, are wounds. If you position those bodies correctly in the vehicle, and if you've got the geometry correct, then those wounds, if created by a single bullet, will line up.
Perhaps the most intriguing discovery is the wound to Governor Connolly.
There's an oblong entry wound. I actually had Governor Connolly in my office and said, "Governor, would you take your shirt off?" And he did, and you could see the scar. It's still there. It's an oblong scar.
The length of the wound was the same as a Mannlicher Carcano bullet, which meant it entered the governor's back sideways. Why did it enter sideways? Because the bullet was tumbling.
The bullet tumbles after it passes through John Kennedy, and this is a well-known phenomena of long bullets. The Carcano slug is actually quite long compared to its diameter. And after it goes through John Kennedy, it does begin to tumble as a result of the tissue impact that it had.
Forensic scientist Dr. John Latimer attempted to duplicate the tumbling bullet scenario. He fired Mannlicher Carcano bullets through an animal carcass used to simulate the muscle and flesh of a human neck.
As we started doing the experiments, I noticed fairly quickly that the bullet holes in Connolly, in our Connolly simulations, practically always represented a tumbling bullet.
The holes in Dr. Latimer's targets were oblong, just like Governor Connolly's wound. But Dr. Wecht and other critics remain unconvinced. Dr. Wecht argues that a bullet doing all this damage would look very different from the bullet recovered from the stretcher in Parkland Hospital.
Commission Exhibit 399, the stretcher bullet. This bullet, which produced 7 wounds in 2 men, broke 2 bones in John Connolly, and I mean significant fractures. This bullet, the magic bullet, shows no deformation.
The bullet was slightly flattened on the side, and there was lead coming out of the bottom. But the nose wasn't crushed, as one would expect. How was that possible? Dr. Latimer set up a second ballistic test to try to find out. He fired bullets through the animal carcass and parts of cadavers representing Governor Connolly's rib, wrist, and femur. When the bullets tumbled, they hit the bone sideways.
So that it squeezed the soft gray lead out of the copper jacket, out of the rear of it, like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube.
And it left the nose of the bullet intact, similar to the so-called magic bullet. But none of this actually proved the single bullet theory, only that it was plausible. In 1978, a congressional committee asked chemist Dr. Vincent Gwynn to use neutron activation analysis to compare the so-called magic bullet to the bullet fragments in Governor Connolly's wrist. Dr. Gwynn removed a tiny portion of the bullet's soft lead inner core and placed it in a nuclear reactor to make it radioactive. Then he used gamma spectroscopy to measure the gamma rays. Dr. Gwynn then tested the 2 bullet fragments from Governor Connolly's wrist and compared those to the sample from the magic bullet.
The fragments from Governor Connolly's wrist matched very closely with the pristine or magic bullet. He concluded that it was highly probable that these belonged to the same bullet.
Ballistic tests of the magic bullet show that its lands and grooves match Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano rifle found in the schoolbook depository. Despite all the claims that one bullet couldn't have wounded both President Kennedy and Governor Connolly, forensic tests proved that it did.
The autopsy on President Kennedy, the medical records on Governor Connolly, and the ballistic evidence entirely consistent with the single bullet theory.
When we return, forensic science tries to answer a question that has haunted researchers for decades. Was there a second gunman firing at the president that day? Perhaps the most hotly debated issue surrounding the Kennedy assassination is the direction of the bullet that caused the president's fatal head wound. The Zapruder film clearly shows the president's head moving backwards at the moment of impact, as if the shot had come from in front of him. This has led to widespread speculation that there were two shooters firing at the president that day, not one.
There was one shooter in the rear, and there was one shooter behind the wooden stockade fence on the grassy knoll. And that accounts for many things, including the movement of John Kennedy's body when he is struck in the head.
The theory that a second shooter fired from behind this picket fence from the so-called grassy knoll in front of the president has endured for 40 years. Josiah Thompson, author and assassination researcher, was one of the first writers to suggest a grassy knoll shooter. As proof, Thompson cites two motorcycle policemen riding just behind the presidential limousine.
Hargis and Martin were both struck with impact debris from the shot which hit Kennedy in the head. Hargis was hit such a shot that immediately after the shooting, he dumped his cycle, turned to the knoll area, and ran up in this area. He did that because he thought a shot came from the right front.
Other witnesses reported the same thing.
You had Bill and Gail Newman, who were standing on the grassy knoll.
I thought the bullet was just going a few inches over the top of my head from directly behind.
I thought they were coming from behind us, which would be the concrete retaining wall area.
For me, though, the single best witness is a man named S.M. Holland, who's standing on an overpass.
Well, Skinny Holland was a crusty old railroad man. Holland saw some smoke make its way out from under some bushes along the stockade fence on the knoll.
Thinking it was gunfire, Holland said he ran over to the fence and saw fresh footprints and cigarette butts. The most powerful support for the second gunman theory comes from the Zapruder film and the backwards movement of the president's head.
If he struck from the rear, a bullet, 6.5 millimeter copper jacket striking him in the back of the head, going to drive him forward. Well, look at the Zapruder film. Frame by frame by frame by frame by frame by frame. He's going backward into his wife's right shoulder.
But what happens when this question is tested by ballistic analysis? Forensic investigator Dr. John Latimer tried duplicating the fatal headshot using human skulls filled with animal tissue and white paint to help photography catch the action.
You can see the impact of the bullet. You can see that the great blast of whitish brain substance goes out the front of the head, and that the head reacts to that by going backwards towards the gun. There were no occasions where some of the time it didn't work.
The experiment showed it was possible for a bullet fired from the rear to cause a backwards head movement. And crime scene reconstruction techniques and forensic animation show something else. This is the position of President Kennedy at the moment of the fatal head wound. To his right is the grassy knoll. As you can see, President Kennedy's head is parallel to the grassy knoll at the time the fatal shot was fired. The president's autopsy shows no wound from the side.
This particular bullet destroyed the right hemisphere, didn't destroy the left hemisphere. You see a bullet that coming in this direction. No bullet from this direction. There's no entry wound on this side of the skull.
In 1978, a panel of distinguished forensic pathologists studied the X-rays of Kennedy's head wound and concluded the same thing. Dr. Michael Bodden chaired that committee.
On the X-ray, there was a bullet that entered the upper back of the head. Little fragments broke off and streamed through the brain. The bullet itself exited and was recovered, which are entirely indicative that the shot was from back to front.
Neutron activation analysis confirmed that the bullet fragments in Kennedy's brain and the bullet fragments found on the floor of the limousine were all from the same bullet. No other fragments from any other bullets were found in the limousine or in the president's brain. But these forensic tests haven't silenced conspiracy theorists. Many still believe there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll, and they will only concede that he may have missed.
I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt there was a shot from the grassy knoll. That's the degree of confidence. And the shot from the grassy knoll does not hit the president. It misses him based on all the autopsy material.
As proof, Professor Blakey and others point to this. A Dallas police audio tape of radio transmissions recorded on the day of the assassination. Many believe it contains the sound of 4 gunshots, not 3, as the Warren Commission claimed. Could these scratchy sounds provide proof of a conspiracy? In the years since the assassination, rumors of conspiracy and cover-up have continued to grow, fueled by countless assassination books, websites, documentaries, and a Hollywood movie. The most powerful evidence pointing to a conspiracy was discovered in 1978 by a government committee investigating the assassination. It was a Dallas police radio transmission from a motorcycle microphone stuck in the on position. Many believed the motorcycle was in the presidential motorcade and had picked up sounds which were transmitted to police headquarters and recorded on a crude device called a dictaphone. The plastic belt had been in a drawer for 14 years and largely forgotten until the 1978 committee convened.
Immediately we wondered if that was at the same time of the assassination, and that's when we had it analyzed.
Could this recording hold clues about what really happened in Dealey Plaza that day? For answers, the government committee asked Dr. James Barger, chief scientist at Bolt, Beranek and Newman, one of the nation's leading acoustics firms, to analyze the tape. The recording didn't have any distinct sounds of gunfire, only clicks and pops, which posed an immediate problem for investigators.
You had the impression that there was a motorcycle very near to the microphone. You could hear crowd sounds, cheering the president, and all sorts of noise and static, dominated by the motorcycle.
After filtering out much of the noise, Barger found several large spikes, followed by smaller spikes on the waveform that resembled gunfire and echoes. To see if they really were gunshots, he proposed an elaborate series of forensic ballistic tests.
And I said, well, that's fine, Jim. What do you want to do? And he says, I want to shoot a gun in Dealey Plaza. And I thought, oh, my God, he wants to go down to Dealey Plaza and shoot guns. Needless to say, that'd be a media circus.
But they did it anyway. Engineers set up 36 microphones in Dealey Plaza along the motorcade route, then fired test shots from both the schoolbook depository and the grassy knoll. When those test shots were compared to the sounds on the audio tape, scientists found what they believed to be 4 gunshots, 3 from the schoolbook depository, 1 from the grassy knoll. To make absolutely certain, a second set of scientists reviewed Barger's analysis.
It appears that with a probability of 95% or better, there was indeed a shot fired from the grassy knoll.
It was the first hard forensic evidence of a conspiracy. Here's Mr. Zapruder's film placed in sync with what scientists believed were the 4 gunshots on the motorcycle tape. We've added a sound to denote the shots.
I was quite struck by how well they matched.
And if you don't believe the tape or the film, this is an enormous coincidence. And that's 2 shots match beautifully, about 6 seconds between them. And then you can fit the other shots in with other events that you can see on the film.
He calls Professor's wife.
In 1978, a government committee concluded that there was most likely a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. Conclusions based in part on this audio tape. These scientific findings stirred immediate controversy. The first significant challenge came from an unlikely source. Steve Barber is an audiophile and an amateur JFK assassination researcher. When an article about the assassination appeared in a magazine in July of 1979, he naturally bought it. Inside was a cheap vinyl recording of the Dallas police motorcycle tape. After playing the record over and over, Barber heard someone speaking at the same time as the alleged gunshots.
I really couldn't make out the rest of it, you know, and then I thought, I'm not going to figure this out. Well, then I was listening one more time, and I thought, wait a minute, I've heard this. Where else have I heard this?
Barber then realized he had heard this message before in another recording. It was the voice of the Dallas County Sheriff, Bill Decker, telling his men to cordon off the area around the school book depository. But police records showed that Decker actually made this statement about a minute after the assassination.
What I hear is solid evidence that there cannot be any gunshots, and it was something that was said over a minute after the president had already been killed.
Did an amateur's revelation mean that the government scientists were wrong? Barber took his suspicions to the National Academy of Sciences, where another study of the tape was taking place. Those scientists confirmed Steve Barber's findings and concluded that the sounds on the tape were just noise. But in 2001, a study in a respected British forensic journal found the opposite, that the sounds were indeed 4 gunshots. So what's actually on this tape? To find out, Forensic Files commissioned its own forensic audio analysis of the recording. In a moment, you'll see the test and learn its surprising results. For years, this recording of a Dallas police radio transmission has been shrouded in mystery and controversy. Some scientific studies say it proves the existence of a second assassin, while others say it's nothing but noise. In an attempt to shed new light on the Dallas tape, Forensic Files commissioned its own test using the most sophisticated technology available. Bob Berkovitz, the retired chairman of Sensometrics, a Boston, Massachusetts audio research firm and a respected forensic audio expert, performed the study.
If we're going to find out what happened in 1963, it will be by continuing application of the scientific method to what data we have.
Applying that method, Berkovitz began his 6-month investigation by reviewing all of the earlier acoustic studies and their conclusions. Berkovitz used the same copy studied by the National Academy of Sciences 20 years ago, a copy that hadn't been touched since.
First, I located the places that were said to be gunshots. The sound waves were further examined using several programs. One that simply displays the sound wave pattern in great detail. Another software that we've developed mainly for speech study that displays spectrograms.
Almost immediately, Berkovits found a problem.
When we look at these shots, they're very different from each other. This is shot number 1, for example. This is shot number 2. Now we'll go to shot number 3. Look nothing like each other. So that if one of them looked like a gunshot, we would have to conclude the other two didn't.
Next, he performed a spectrographic analysis of what were assumed to be the engine sounds of the motorcycle moving along the motorcade, and he noticed something peculiar.
What you see on the screen going from left to right is a wide gray band, and that represents the noise. Within this band are 2 darker stripes that stay in the same place from left to right throughout the noise. This shows that the noise isn't changing in any significant way during this time, and you'd expect the noise to change if it were made by a motorcycle that was moving.
So Berkovits concluded that the motorcycle wasn't even in the presidential motorcade. Finally, Berkovits tackled the most important question of all. Are these gunshots on the motorcycle tape? This is the acoustic fingerprint of a grassy knoll gunshot, the result of calculations made by government scientists in 1978. This is the muzzle blast, followed by echoes. This is the waveform of what's recorded on the motorcycle tape. When government scientists compared these two, they found 14 possible echoes on the motorcycle tape. 10 matched the echoes on the grassy knoll fingerprint. 10 echoes matching out of 14 was a pretty high percentage, and explains why government scientists concluded the sound on the motorcycle tape was a grassy knoll gunshot. Berkovits decided to do the same comparison, only this time he did it a bit differently.
If we use the procedure described by the original investigators of printing out a picture of the waveform on a long roll of paper and then measuring it visually and deciding which impulses to include and which not and which to count, there might be a chance of human error.
Berkovits designed a computer program to compare these two waveforms, eliminating both human error and the possibility of subjectivity.
The computer program looks one by one for each of the echoes that are said to have occurred after the gunshot was fired to see if there is an impulse that matches within 1,000th of a second.
The computer also took into account such variables as the speed of the dictabelt recording. The computer identified twice the number of possible echoes on the motorcycle tape, and only 5 of those matched the acoustic fingerprint. With 5 matches out of a possible 25, Berkovits says it's highly unlikely this is a gunshot.
We were unable to find any evidence that, in fact, there's a gunshot in the recording.
Berkovits then increased the latitude by which the computer calculates a match by lowering the level of what could be considered an echo and adjusting the estimated speed of the motorcycle tape. Even this didn't improve the odds of a gunshot. Then Berkovits asked a more basic question. If the sounds weren't gunshots, what were they? First, he had the computer generate random noise. Then, he selected 3 different portions of the random noise and compared them to the acoustic fingerprint.
I found that the numbers were not that different, and in some cases were better than the correlation and probabilities obtained with the police recording. Therefore, the impulses can't be the gunfire of assassins.
And Berkowitz's tests also confirmed what Steve Barber found years earlier, that the sheriff's message, "Hold everything secure," was recorded on the motorcycle channel at the time the sheriff said it, not by any other means or methods. Scientific proof that the audio tape, argued about and studied by numerous government panels and independent researchers for 25 years, wasn't even recorded at the time of the assassination.
I hope that what we've done and talked about today will bring us a little closer to the truth, and it too is open for criticism and discussion, which is as it should be.
Questions answered and questions that remain when the JFK assassination investigation reopened returns. The echoes of gunfire that day in Dealey Plaza have resonated through every town, large and small, in the 40 years since the assassination. The question everyone asks, did Lee Harvey Oswald murder John F. Kennedy, and did he do it alone? We may never know everything about the assassination, but there are some things we can say with certainty. If there was an elusive grassy knoll shooter, he not only missed his target, but left not one shred of scientific evidence behind. Over the past 40 years, numerous forensic investigations, including this one, have concluded the Warren Commission was correct. Oswald acted alone. But the search for answers will inevitably continue.
I don't know what happened. I've studied this for the last 40 years, and I don't know what happened.
What happened to President Kennedy was not a conspiracy of bad people trying to hide whoever really killed the president, but a conspiracy of ignorant people who didn't know how to properly do an autopsy and to provide information to the investigators.
It is a scandal of the first order that the President of the United States, when he was assassinated, did not get the same forensic autopsy that you or I would get if we were shot in any major city.
I think belief in conspiracy is just another way of articulating uncertainty. There's something dark out there. I don't know what it is, but it must be something. But most people just weren't prepared to accept this really dreadful thought that this schnook, this nobody, could climb up some stairs and kill John F. Kennedy. That was hard to believe.